We're going to go back to doing what we did a couple weeks ago in the sense of I'm going to try to cover some material, and so it won't be taking a lot of questions or comments to begin with. I'm going to try to get through some material for us, and then we'll go to questioning and commenting. Obviously, if you have something that needs to be said, go ahead and say it. I'm just saying I'm not going to be encouraging questions and comments in the early portion so that we can get through this material. We are studying the biblical doctrine of corporal punishment. This idea the question has been asked, and we looked at a question. We have several questions we asked, but one of the big questions that people have today, especially young people in the church, is spanking abuse? And the reason for that being that in the field of psychology, there are quite a few people who've written quite a few books that trying to indicate as such. So I want to pick up starting this morning with picking up on a statement that I made last week, and then also jumping into finishing out exegeting our passages that have to do with corporal punishment in the Bible. I listed up here all of our previous passages that we've gone through so far, along with the key words that we found in those passages. But if you give me just a moment, I'm going to pull this up. I made a comment last week, and then I went back and did some reading on this particular subject. Okay, so I made this statement last week that there are no good studies that show that spanking a child causes long-term negative effects in that individual. In other words, that's going to have some sort of negative effect on them when they grow up. And I pointed out when I made that statement, I said, this is, out of everything that I'm going to say, this is probably the one that somebody on the internet, on one of our YouTube shorts or something, is going to, I can just already see it, is going to jump on there and be like, no, this study or this study or this study proves that spanking causes long-term negative effects in children. So I guess Monday I sat down and I was like, I'm going to look through and look at this and see what's the most recent study that proves that spanking causes negative long-term effects. And so just so happens, and it's from Harvard, so it has to be right if it's from Harvard, that pops up, and there's this study that was done, and I want to read just briefly a statement from that study. And here's what he says. They go through kind of how they did the study, but I don't want to give too much away in going through that. I want to go through what's said by this guy named Quartas, who was overseeing the study. Perhaps surprisingly, says Quartas, spanking elicits a similar response in children's brains to more threatening experiences like sexual abuse. You see the same reactions in the brain, Quartas explains. This guy who's in charge of the study, in his interview to explain the results of the study, says that spanking has the similar result in the brain to more serious things like sexual abuse. And he says more about that throughout this, but that was kind of the most striking moment where he says you see the same reactions in the brain between the two. Now, with that in mind, you can understand, and I think it is important that we understand. The reason I'm starting with this is I think that there needs to be an understanding of this. We have people, even in the Lord's church, who will post online that you should never spank your children. And they will say that it's abusive or it's wrong or it's bad. And I want you to understand something. Many of the people in this room obviously would strongly disagree with that stance. If someone posted online, you shouldn't spank your children, it's abusive. The area of understanding that I think you need to have is that those people who would post something like that, or those people who would make those arguments, they will read right off of, and I believe that's actually off of Harvard's website right here. Yeah, harvard.edu. That person who is thinking that way very likely went to harvard.edu and read the results of this study And the way it's presented here is if it's factually causal, which to me is insane that a statement like that can be made and then published here, especially when we look into what actually happened in this study. But I guess what I'm getting at is, if you took this at face value, you would say, well, man, the study's been done, and it's been shown that to spank your kid in their brain is equivalent to sexually abusing them. Except that the study doesn't show anything like that. This man clearly had an agenda and is giving statements that in and of themselves are not completely counterfactual, but they hide important details about the fact that actually his statement goes way beyond what the evidence produced from the study could potentially say. And you see that when you go to Psychology Today. Psychology Today is definitely an anti-spanking organization, and yet with their reference to this particular study, he says the authors concluded that their data support the hypothesis that corporal punishment alters the neural responses to threat. However, they had to admit it is not possible to draw causal conclusions because of the nature of the data. Do you know that if you're on the harvard.edu page where the man is describing, he consistently links it to children who have had traumatic events. But nowhere in that article did I find a single statement in which he admits in that article that it's not causal. You have to go over to Psychology Today, who evidently they've sat down and read the entire report, and they dig out this little jewel somewhere in that report that I told that, and that's what I brought up last week. There are plenty of studies that show correlation. It is not fair and it's not appropriate for someone to do a study, which, by the way, this study only it does what I mentioned that the other studies do. This study included only 147 young people around the age of 12, number one. Number two, all those young people self-reported whether or not they'd been spanked, whether or not they'd been abused. There is, therefore, in essence, no control group because they split them into three. They split them into never been spanked. They put them, and then another category was spanked, and then another category was abused, which is also kind of odd because the general gist or view of those doing the report was that spanking itself is abuse. So where were they drawing that defining line between the two? Not only that, even when they draw that dividing line, they're asking a 12-year-old to self-examine and self-report whether what happened to them was spanking or abuse. It's just, and this is the kind of thing you see, and unfortunately it gets put out, and especially once it hits social media, it gets put out as these little blurbs that are somehow factual. And so what this turns into is this very nuanced explanation of a study turns into a really fancy-looking Instagram post that says, if you spank your kid, it's the same as sexual abuse, and then links back to this, and then just puts a little tag to this study. And so we just want to understand as we're studying, we're looking for the biblical answer to this question, but we also need to have respect for the fact that some people who have various views might do so because of bad information, because there certainly is an agenda in our culture, not all of our culture, there's still people who spank, but there's a bit of an agenda in our culture to try to push people or persuade people not to spank their children ever. And so I just want to point that out before we get back into exegeting our passages, and we can comment on that or talk about that when we're done looking at these scriptures together. But let's go ahead and get started back into the scriptures. Proverbs chapter 20 is where we're going to start, so meet me at Proverbs 20:30. Yes, sir.
Why do you listen to folks without knowledge? And
Yeah, got to be careful, especially when something that is complex and involves a great deal of judgment is posted on the internet as if it were simple. This goes in any direction. A lot of things just aren't simple and clear cut. That you have to actually dig in. You actually have to do your own research and do your own digging to find answers. It's true like that with the scriptures. You can do a very terse reading of the scriptures, and maybe you get what you're supposed to get out of it. Maybe you don't. Typically, it takes more digging and diving in. We're going to do that now in Proverbs 20, verse 30. And it reads, "Blows that hurt cleanse away evil, as do stripes the inner depths of the heart." Now, of course, this is very figurative language, but what is the figure of? The figure or the picture here is that blows, that is corrective blows, they hurt, that is, in the moment they're unpleasant, but what? They cleanse away evil, meaning how? Well, in the simple sense of corrective discipline, or whether this is probably having to do with the idea of an adult, I would guess, in this particular passage, but corrective discipline doesn't feel good in the moment, but if it cleanses away evil, that is, if it predispositions someone to stay away from evil behavior in the future because it was corrective, then that's a good thing. As do stripes, which oftentimes stripes is with reference to the practice of receiving lashes, so this would certainly be an adult in this case. As do stripes, the inner depths of the heart. Again, just imagining that someone was rebellious and someone was breaking the law, and they did end up giving them those stripes, and the concept being, yes, the stripes would not feel good. However, if they change the heart, and you can imagine that of a young man who maybe goes out and breaks God's law and is living rebelliously, and he receives those stripes and maybe rethinks what he's doing. And if he does that, if the inner depths of his heart is changed, well, that pain, that slight pain for a time, was worth it because it corrected his long-term behavior. And we're familiar with this, and typically parents who spank have this kind of concept in mind as well. But we have this concept of mind and will as far as even our adults in this country. Our prison system doesn't do corporal punishment, but we do have the idea that if a young man is rebellious and foolish and breaks the law, that he might spend a few years in prison. The idea being that hopefully when he gets out, he won't want to go back there again, and so he will correct his behavior. We talked before about, and this would apply again here, I think this verse really makes me think about the idea of the doctor. It doesn't feel good to get cut on by a scalpel. It doesn't feel good to have the surgeon, cut you open. Yet at the same time, if you have a terminal disease, you'll suffer that pain of having to recover from being cut open if they're able to remove that disease. And so just this concept of there are things that are not pleasant in the moment and yet are good for us. This would be the same as going on a diet or hitting the gym. They may not be our favorite thing in the world, yet they're good for us. Let's move on to Proverbs 22:6. This is one that's a pretty famous passage. "Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he was old, he will not depart from it." Go back to Proverbs 20, verse 30 right quick. I didn't get that down. We're going to go back into this, but let's go back. Go back to, can you go back to 2030? I'm going to put blows and stripes here for our words. I just didn't get that down. Okay, you can go back again. Again, I do believe that in Proverbs 20:30 that those blows and stripes are figurative, and I guess I didn't specifically point that out. We pointed out when we covered the verse where he says, "He who spares the rod hates his son." And I was saying that some people take the rod there to be figurative. I don't buy that anymore. I just don't. I don't think you can make any argument for rod there being figurative. But that being said, even if it were figurative, and that's true for that verse, and that's true for Proverbs 20, verse 30, the blows and stripes, even if they are figurative, and I believe it is figurative in 20:30, I don't believe it is in the other. But even if that were figurative, the thing we have to understand is God would not use a sinful figure to teach a righteous point. You see what I'm saying? So in other words, like if you spare the rod, you spoil the child. If you spare the rod, a man who spares a rod hates his son. If you take that man who spares his rod hates his son, and you say, I think the rod, the shabet there, yes, I understand that's a rod with which you would whack an animal, you would smack, but I think here it's figurative. It doesn't really mean to spank the child with the switch. He means a rod in the sense of the rod of correction figuratively. Okay, but what would the figure be of? I mean, if it's a figure, it has to be representing something. What is the picture that's being represented when he uses the term rod? Well, the picture is to hit with a rod. Like, even if you could say it's figurative language, you can't just say it's figurative language. You have to say it's figurative language, and he's using something that you should never, ever, ever do to explain to you what you should do. And that just doesn't make sense. This is figurative. And yet it still is saying something to me, which is what? Corporal discipline works. Why? Because he's using the figure of corporate discipline to explain spiritual change. And so corporal discipline works. All right, now we're going on to 22:6. In 22:6, he says, train up the child in the way he should go. So here, certainly, one of our key words would be to train. We are to train our children. I think that's maybe another thing that in some field or thought processes in modern psychology is that we're like parents have become almost, and you see this in the grocery store too, by the way. Parents have become almost the big brothers and big sisters to their children instead of their parents. And you'll see a mom argue with her daughter the way I used to argue with my big sister. And the way I never argued with my mother, not for more than 15 or 20 seconds till she could get to me. And dad's got to be cool and a buddy, and we got to be friends. And the truth of the matter is that as parents, or as those seeking to be parents one day, our job, our role is to train our children. That is, we have authority, we've been down the road they're on, and we're supposed to be training them how to go down that road correctly. And you can't very well train somebody if they're your buddy. In fact, I was talking to a soldier Wednesday night, and he was talking about, because I was asking about, can you fraternize, with your superiors or whatever? And he was talking about how in his own chain of command, you wouldn't go out and hang out with somebody that's ranked above you, right? Or obviously below you if you're ranked above them. And why is that? And he said, because then when you're there, when you're in service and you're doing your job and you mess up, now it's your buddy. It's not your commanding officer. And that those lines can get blurred. Well, it's the same way of being a parent. It's not to say, obviously, I like to have fun with my girls. I have a plaque on my piano that says, what does it say? Weird dads build character. Okay? I enjoy goofing off with my daughters. But at the same time, we can be in the middle of a fun play, like doing something fun and playing, and I can change my face to a certain look, and they will all freeze, right? It's not to say you can't enjoy your children. It's just that you cannot be viewed by your children as anything other than their parent, their mom, their dad, not their buddy, not their sort of older sibling. Our job is to train. Our job is to teach them. They will not be where they're supposed to be unless we train them. It says, obviously, this idea of training does not speak specifically to spanking, and we're not saying that it does. And then he says, when he is old, he will not depart from it. And we won't go into too much about that other than the fact that we have a promise that if we will train our child the way that God wants us to, that type of training will assist that child in longevity in carrying it out. I do believe that this is talking about training a child in the way that they are bent, not about if you train your child in the gospel, they'll never leave the gospel. I believe it's talking about if you train your child the way that they're supposed to go, they won't depart from it when they're old. That being said, let's move on to 22:15. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of the child. The rod of correction will drive it far from him. Now, here's another one. So I'm going to stop right in Proverbs as long as we're staying the same ones. So if we're in Proverbs 22, now we're in verse 15. Notice what we see here. The rod. Once again, this rod of correction. Now, once again, someone could try to argue. It's a little bit harder on this one to argue, but someone could try to argue, now that rod of correction is completely figurative. It means when you say, no, Billy, you're not allowed to do that. That's the rod of correction driving it from him. Come on, again, just put yourself into the shoes of a Hebrew person living in this agrarian, shepherding society who carry around, that word rod there is the shebet, who either they or some family member or friend, they definitely have a family member or friend who's a shepherd if they're not a shepherd, who takes a shebet with them and goes out with his sheep and smacks them with it when they go the wrong direction. And in that mindset, go back and tell one of those people hearing this scripture and go, I think what he means about a rod of correction driving it, what he means is when you say no to your child. I just think that they would look at you like you're crazy. I think the plain reading of it in that culture, they would see the direct link between the times that they had to say, no, sheep, go this way, and the times they had to say, no, son, don't steal, or whatever it is that they were getting a spanking for. I think you need the help of 1970s psychologists to read it any other way than that. And so this is, again, that same word for rod there that's used. And actually it's going to be used in just a moment because we're going to take a look at it. So I won't give that away yet. All right. Let's go to Proverbs 23:13 through 14. So we have the rod again, the rod of correction. Proverbs 23:13 through 14. Now this one's even tougher to get around. Do not withhold correction from a child, for if you beat him with a rod, he will not die. You shall beat him with a rod and deliver his soul from hell. This is obviously talking about an older child in this particular case. Well, I say obviously. It makes sense that it would. You could argue that if you, because he's talking about delivering a soul from hell, and we know that little children don't go to hell. It's not possible. Now, what it could be meant is, if when they're very young, you spank them and correct them, then when they get older and their soul is in danger, that is, when they do reach an age where they can understand that age of accountability, or that maturity of accountability, that you'll be delivering their soul from hell by the spankings they got when they were younger. They understand action and consequence and so on. They're an orderly child. Or it could mean, remember we had read before that if the son was rebellious, that they should punish him, but if he refused, then they take him before the gate, and the people would judge him, and he'd be stoned, right? That was clearly an older son. It's not a 5-year-old, right? This is someone who's still in his parents' house, but he has reached advanced age. He's reached maturity in his parents' home. This could mean that. This could be hearkening back to that idea of this is talking about a son who is in your home but has reached an age of maturity and could be judged. Either way you look at it, you'd want to deliver your child, correct? So in other words, the principle can be applied to in either case. If I've got a 5-year-old that has begun being rebellious, just incredibly rebellious, trying to test the parent, and I tell him, no, you're not going to do that, and I spank him, I can view that as I'm preparing him for the future. At the same time, if I've got an 18-year-old that's living in my house that's sliding into a life of sin, I can address him strongly with the intention of delivering his soul from hell. But the tricky part about this one is, if you 23:14, is that where we are? 23, yeah, 23:14. Is he doesn't mince any words about what the rod is for. It's a rod, yes, but it's a rod directly connected with the term beat. Now, the way we use the term beat makes this sound more negative than it really would be in our minds. With our idea of beat is like to take a beating is like to beat down. This simply means to strike, right? To beat here, to strike with the rod. Again, even if you wanted to argue it's figurative, but it's a figure for striking someone with a rod for what? For their own good, to deliver the soul from hell. The idea that physically striking someone for their own good cannot be wrong according to your Bible. It cannot be, as we mentioned last week, it cannot be inherently sinful. It may not be authorized in the New Testament. You might make that argument, but it cannot be inherently sinful. God would not use this language. This example could not be given if it were inherently sinful to do that. If it were abusive to ever strike someone for their long-term good, then this verse would not be in the Bible. We're going to go to Proverbs 26:3. Proverbs 26:3. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the donkey, a rod for the fool's back. You're going to keep seeing this idea of rods and fools. This verse is not about spanking a child, but it is, once again, about corporal punishment. And they had corporal punishment when you were an adult. If you were a fool, if you violated the law, if you accosted someone, then you got the rod. All right, so let's go to Proverbs 29:15. 29:15. A lot in Proverbs on this, by the way. A lot in Proverbs. Most of our verses, in fact, come from Proverbs. Proverbs 29:15 reads, "The rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother." Now, here's where it gets a little bit tricky. If I were holding out hope to think that the rod is figurative for rebuking, for correcting, I run into a real problem in Proverbs 29:15. Because why? Because he uses two distinct terms. He says the rod, term one, and rebuke, term two. So you have a child that is in, you've got a child that is in great trouble. And if my thought so far in all these scriptures we've looked at is that the rod is simply representative of a stronger response of discipline toward a child, but of course not literal. What would it be figurative of? It would have to be figurative of rebuking the child. It's when your child really goes over the edge and you have to rebuke them. Well, the problem with that is you have that as its own term here, and it says the rod and rebuke, which teaches us two things. It teaches one thing from the negative, and from the negative, what it teaches us is that the rod cannot consistently and always be viewed as figurative for rebuking because it shows up in the same text as rebuke. So that would be the negative concept. It denies that possibility. But then the positive side to this is this. Spanking in and of itself may not be a very good idea. If you're going to correct the child with spanking, it ought to be a teaching moment. In other words, it ought to come with the rebuke. I know that my parents, and I'm not saying this is the best way to do it necessarily, but it seemed to be effective for me. But my parents, and this is actually my least favorite part of the spanking, they would say, I would do whatever I did, and they would say, go to your room, I'll be there in a minute. I don't know how many of you got sent to your rooms for spankings, but that's like the worst time because you're sitting there anticipating it. And maybe you're taking time to put on to quickly put on like some pajama pants underneath your clothes and stuff like that to try to pad up things a little bit. But you're sitting there waiting for it. But then my parent would come back there and say, now why are you getting a spanking? And before I actually got the spanking, I had to say what it was, right? If I'm just spanking, and we're going to get into this a little bit more in a minute, but if I'm just spanking because, well, they did something wrong and I just spank them and then move on, I'm probably missing something. The rod and the rebuke are going to do much better than just they get swatted on the rear end 3 times every time they do X, Y, or Z. That time where you're correcting, that time where you're instructing, that time where you're getting on to them, and you maybe even have an opportunity as a parent to learn, okay, what is it that led up to them doing this? None of that occurs if it's just the rod. And I think a lot of times people who are against the rod or against spanking are people who have seen spanking used in that way that can be ineffective and seems like it's just repetitive. So this gives us a negative, but it also gives us a positive. I think it defends against the idea of the rod being figurative all the time, and I think it also instructs us that the rod alone is not ideal. The child left to himself, though, brings shame to his mother, and that's the second part to this, the child left to himself. Someone might say, well, I think spanking is abuse. Okay, well, I'm confident, and I'm not saying that if you don't, that someone who doesn't spank necessarily does this, but I'm confident that not correcting your child enough is abuse. It would be a neglect. Now, you can debate and determine whether that means spanking or not, but I'm just saying, if you're a parent who's lazy with correcting your child and just kind of for a sake of ease or a sake of I give up, just let your child kind of do what they want to do, the scriptures speak explicitly to that. They'll bring shame to the mother. We got one more verse in the Old Testament, Proverbs 29:17. Proverbs 29:17. And he says, correct your son, and he will give you rest. Yes, he will give delight to your soul. And here we just get this idea of correction. Correction's good. Correction brings positive things. Now, That's the end of our time with these scriptures in the Old Testament. And so now we're going to carry this through into the New Testament. And before we do, we want to point this out again. What law are we under today? I will ask a question. What law are we under today? The new covenant of Jesus Christ. Yeah, the perfect law of liberty, James 1:25. Okay, so if we're under the perfect law of liberty, what law was done away with to bring about being under the perfect law of liberty? Yeah, the Mosaic law, right? The handwritten ordinances that were nailed to the cross. Okay? And so when we're reading from Proverbs and other passages, Deuteronomy and all that from the Old Testament, what law was that under? Yeah, so what law were they under? Law of Moses, right? So we understand that for religious practices and for what we do as Christians, that those handwritten law of ordinance that they were done away with, they were nailed to the cross. In fact, the Hebrews writer tells us that a testament doesn't go into effect until the death of the testator. So even Jesus lived under the old covenant up until the time of his death, but upon his death, that old law was put to death, the new law could be alive. And so we live under that new and living law, the perfect law of liberty, James 1:25, the law of Jesus Christ. And so what some people might think here is, well, yes, but I can see the points that have been made about how it's pretty clear about that this rod here is for striking. And in fact, which I don't think we directly talked about, but this rod here is the same rod from the 23rd Psalm. Well, the shepherd has his staff and he has his rod, and the staff he can use to gently move the sheep this way, to pull the sheep up out of a crevice. It's got that curved end, typically. And then it can be used to defend against animals. It's kind of hardy. And then he's got that shebet, that rod that he can smack the sheep with if they go the wrong direction. So but again, you say, but that's all Old Testament. So, but we got to remember Romans 15:14. The things which are written aforetime are written for our learning. And so the Old Testament is certainly not where we go to find authority for religious practices today. It's certainly not where we go to find authority for my Christian living today. And yet it is a place of learning for me. And that is to be said what? Well, that's to be said that if there's a law back here where he says, this is what I'm going to have you to do to fulfill the law. No, I'm not. It's not required of me to do that. In fact, again, the Hebrews writer said, if you go back under one point, you're guilty of all. And so I can't go back to some portion of the law or some piece of the law, but what I can do in the Old Testament is I can learn divine truths about God, about his creation, about the nature of our existence. For instance, if I go back to James, I live in a world today where they say there's men and there's women, and women can become men and men can become women, and there's however many genders, depending on where you live, there's this many genders and all this kind of stuff. If I go back to Genesis and I read in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Well, that's before Mosaic law. You're going all the way back to the time of the garden, and yet I tell you that's a biblical truth that will always hold. In other words, what I'm learning about is I'm learning about God's creation and my nature, and that's always going to be true. And so the main thing that we can point out from going back and looking at this in the Old Testament, this idea of spanking, is if God said this is what you're supposed to do, which he did. We saw that over and over again. You can't spare the rod. If you do, you hate your son. the rod won't kill him, but it has this positive. And this idea of chastening involving rebuke and rod, that is, verbal and corporal punishments. That tells me something. It does not legislate it to me. Nothing about the Old Testament is legislating anything to me as a father in my home. But what it is doing is it is teaching me about the nature of God and His view of discipline. And so I can know for a fact that it is not contrary to God or His love or His will for me to strike my child, again, within reason, appropriately, with the intention of helping that child to not repeat a bad behavior. And so that I can absolutely know just from studying this in the Old Testament. Now, as we flip to the New Testament, we have to ask ourselves a question. Is there anything in the New Testament that would, first of all, I would need a couple of things to know. I would only be required to do these things if they were under my covenant. Beyond that, it's going to be a matter of wisdom. And I think that, and you'll see this a lot of times, most people in the church look at this and would say, well, it seems to me it'd be wise for me to follow that pattern in this age. Unless the New Testament, now if the New Testament comes in and somewhere and it says, like Jesus did on the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard it's been said to spank your child, but I say unto you that he shall simply give him a time out. If that verse were in the Bible, then you would not be allowed, right? Jesus would have said, I've changed it. You can only do timeouts now. Which, by the way, I hate to be a spoiler. If you're doing some research on this on your own, there's a whole group that teaches that timeouts are abusive. So probably anything you find to punish your child, there will be a group that will tell you how it will ruin your child's future if you do that. And then you got to find the group that tells you how it ruins your child's future if you don't do anything. So you're doomed and there is no hope. If you Google it, I guarantee it. But in the New Testament, I think the best place to go is Hebrews 12, 5 through 11. And we're going to be a little short of time, but we're finishing this next week. We got 2 questions we're going to answer next week. We're going to finish this out with the legal side and then jump into one other quick answer to a question. Let's read this. We have about 2 minutes. Let's just read this passage and then we'll move on. And you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks to you as to sons. My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you are rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourges every son whom he receives. If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us and paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of holiness. Now no chastening seems to be joyful at present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterwards it yields peaceable fruit and righteousness to those who have been trained by it. The book of Hebrews references the Old Testament. It's like most of the book is just a reference to the Old Testament. And so when you look here in this particular passage, he's clearly talking about those old verses in which the Hebrew people knew to chasten their children. Clearly he's talking about those verses, many of which include the rod. But then he gets down at the end and he even says, this type of chastening is what? It's painful in the moment. But what? It has a positive result. And so we're going to pick up from there next Sunday morning, Lord willing. And we're going to close out with those kind of legal questions of, well, yes, but if I'm to spank my child, will I get reported? And we're going to talk about making sure that we don't cross a line from spanking into abuse. Thank you for your attention.